Welcome to Wine Soundtrack USA. Listen to the passion with which producers narrate their winery and their world in 30 answers. Discover their stories, personalities, and passions.
Hello, friends and listeners of Wine Soundtrack. This is Allison Levine, and today I'm with David Ramey of Ramey Wine Cellars in Sonoma. David, welcome, and tell us a little bit about Ramey, where you're located, and what you're producing.
Oh, Allison, thank you. Thanks for asking me. So Ramey Wine Cellars is owned by my wife, Carla, and I. We started it in 1996 after, at that point I'd been making wine for about 18 years for other wineries, Zimi, Matanzas Creek, Chalk Hill, Dominus, Rudd. And going from Chalk Hill to Dominus was the opportunity to start our own brand because Dominus did not make any white wine. And so Christian said, if you want to make a little Chardonnay on the side, that's okay. So we started small, with just 260 cases of Hyde Vineyard Chardonnay. And then, we've grown a little bit now. We went independent. After Dominus, I went to Rudd, and after 4 years there, I left in 2002, and we went independent. So, and we've grown a little, and now our kids, Claire and Alan, have graduated from college and joined the company 4 and 5 years ago, something like that. So we're just, and we make Chardonnay. Make 7 different Chardonnays and some Cabernet Sauvignon from Napa Valley. All the Chardonnays from Sonoma County except for Hyde Vineyard, which is Napa Valley. And make a little Syrah and a little bit of Pinot Noir.
And do you own your vineyards? Are you purchasing fruit or a combination?
A combination. Of course, we started with nothing, just out of cash flow. So you start out by purchasing grapes. We did in 2008, we leased a vineyard Cabernet vineyard in Napa Valley, the Pedregal Vineyard. So that's effectively ours. And then in 2012, late 2012, we bought our ranch, Westside Farms, on West Side Road, just south of Healdsburg. So that's where we have 32 acres of Chardonnay and a couple of decaying hop kiln and baling barn, which we're going to refurbish, and we finally have the permit to build our permanent winery there. We're in 2 leased industrial buildings in Healdsburg with our own equipment, but now that we're finally approved, we're starting the process to build our own winery.
Wow. So now that we got the basic information out of the way, let's go back and tell me, what is your first memory relevant to wine?
First memory, I can tell you it was spending a summer language institute abroad in Madrid and Spain in 1971. And they put us all up. This was I was a student at UC Santa Cruz. And so we got a whole quarter of credits for studying Spanish in Spain and traveling around a little bit. Same cost as doing a quarter at campus. And I thought, well, this is a pretty good deal. And they put us up in different housing options. And I happened to stay with a relatively well-off family. He was a dentist and a very nice couple. And they had a maid. And every morning, I came down for breakfast. It would be set out for me, and there would be coffee and some toast and a glass of red wine.
Really, for breakfast?
For breakfast. It was 1971 in a wealthy Madrileño family.
Wow. Wow, breakfast.
Yeah.
I'm assuming red wine, too.
Red wine, yeah. Yeah.
So once you move past that, that may not be the most memorable wine you ever drank, a good first memory, but what would you say is the most memorable wine you ever drank? And what was the occasion? And I'm going to guess you probably have more than one, so is there one that stands out?
Well, in a way, when you pose that question, often the first thought is that it's the greatest wine you ever drank. But the first wine that comes to mind for me is actually the first bottle of 750 ml bottle that I ever purchased. And it was to take to a friend's house in the Berkeley Hills. And it was a bottle of Wente Brothers Gray Riesling. And the fact that I still remember that
makes it a pretty significant wine.
The memorable bottle. That's the first bottle of wine that I ever bought. And then to follow up, when I was a junior or senior at Santa Cruz, I bought the first case of wine that I ever bought from the quality retailer in downtown Santa Cruz. I still remember it was called Cooper House. And I bought 6 bottles of 1968 Louis Martini Cabernet, was $2.85 a bottle, and 6 bottles of Charles Krug 1968 Cabernet was $3.15 a bottle.
Yes, and those have more than multiplied in value, tripled or quadrupled.
Yeah, many times.
Was there one particular wine that was sort of your aha moment, or the wine that solidified that this was what you wanted to do with your life, or did that happen after you already decided to make wine?
No, there were too many bottles by that point. I had been visiting wineries. My friend Gary Heppel and I from UC Santa Cruz used to ride our bikes from the city on the hill down to Soquel and go tasting with Patty Ballard at Bargetto Winery in Soquel. And then we'd buy a couple of bottles and put them in our backpacks and then pedal back up the hill. I can't believe what kind of shape I was in those days. And then I graduated, and, we were visiting wineries with Gary and some other friends in Napa and Sonoma, and I was reading wine books. When I was a senior at Santa Cruz, I tried to get the Merrill College, to let me organize a wine class. But I was ahead of my time. Later on, they had them, but at that point they didn't. This was 1972. They didn't have any idea what this was. So then I was a waiter for a year in a Sicilian restaurant in Los Altos. So I was around wine and would go up and spend my off day in San Francisco and eat in Italian restaurants in North Beach, Gold Spike and North Beach Restaurant and Cap's Corner, I think. And so I was around wine. I was enjoying wine, visiting wineries, still reading wine books, working in a Sicilian restaurant. So wine was around. And then I left the restaurant and was traveling. I was traveling in Mexico. I was driving. So I was a year out of college now. And I was on my way to what I thought was going to be teaching English in Colombia for a couple of years. And I was thinking, I had a 71 Toyota Hilux pickup truck with no radio. So it was just me and the Saguaro. And I'm thinking, well, what am I going to do when I'm done with this? And, thank God, in French you call it a coup de foudre, a lightning bolt, an inspiration. Was, well, why not make wine? Makes people happy. It's not bad for the environment. It's an aesthetic statement, like it or not. It's concrete on the table, unlike a literary seminar where there's nothing but hot air left over when you're done. And so I was driving along, 5 miles later probably. I'm thinking, but I can't do that. I have to go to UC Davis to get a degree in enology to do that. And then 5 miles later, but that's all, that's just for sons and daughters of industry like Mike Martini. And 5 miles later, no, that's not right. It's the University of California. My parents pay taxes for it. Hell, I pay taxes for it. So I continued on, and I actually went in and out of Mexico twice. I ended up staying with a family in León, Guanajuato in central Mexico. I never made it to Colombia because when I came back, I applied to Davis, and they said, no, you can't come until you have some science. And so...
that's what a liberal arts degree got you.
Yeah, exactly. Especially from UC Santa Cruz, one with no grades, only evaluations. And so at a certain point, I made it to the family. I spent a couple of weeks, and I said, I got to go back and start getting into science. So I drove back, I think about 3 days. I had some kind of fever, and I was driving, and I had no money. I was living on bananas and Coca-Cola, and I got home, and 2 weeks later, I was enrolled at Chem 1A in San Jose State in biology and algebra, and
wow.
So it took 4.5 years from Chem 1A through the Master of Science in Enology from Davis. So I spent 3 semesters at San Jose State and 3 years at Davis. Doing that.
Like a second education altogether.
I'm 8.5 years in university, so I'm pretty well educated.
So I'm curious, you've been drinking wine for a long time and collecting it. If we were to come into your home, what would we find in your cellar today?
Well, according to my wife, way too many Brunellos. For a long time, there were a lot of a lot of Southern runs. Chateauneuf, Gigondas, Vaqueras, Rasteau. They're harder to find. And then, I don't know, starting with the 06 and particularly the 06 vintage of Brunello, I just discovered Brunello, and now I that's probably my favorite. But we have wines from all over the world. I got a lot of white Burgundy, a lot of red Burgundy, a lot of Bordeaux from the good vintages. I have some Zinfandel from my friends in California who make Zin. I have a lot of California Pinot Noir. Mostly, other than California Chardonnay, mostly red from California, Pinot, Cabernet, Syrah, Zinfandel, and otherwise Italian reds and whites, French reds and whites, and some Spanish reds. So pretty eclectic collection. You can find Fiano d'Avellina, you can find Gavi, you can find Vermentino, Verdicchio, Kerner from the Alto Adige.
You're a wine shop unto yourself.
Yeah, you can pretty much find a lot of stuff. A little weak these days on Australia and South America.
Is there any particular wine that you have right now that's giving you great satisfaction?
Well, again, to Carla's regret, Brunello. So often we sometimes end up drinking different wines. I'll open up a Pinot or a Cabernet for Carla, or Syrah for Carla, and I'll open up Brunello, and then we'll drink. She'll have a glass with lunch, and I'll have a half a bottle with lunch, and we put the cork in and come back, and at dinner, we carry on with the same wines, we do have, eclectic tastes.
So, with all of your experience, do you think there's a such thing as a perfect variety?
Of course not. For starters, every meal ideally should start with white wine and then shift to red wine sooner or later, depending on what you're eating. Mm-hmm. So that's the standard lineup. I mean, sometimes we'll start, like if we're in a restaurant and we don't want to drink too much, and we may end up just ordering 1 bottle of red wine, and that's the way it is. But ideally, at least a glass of white and then a couple of glasses of red.
And in terms of making wine, do you think there's a such thing as a perfect variety?
I don't even know how to answer that. No. Yeah. Every variety requires its own. Making wine is a lot like cooking, and just as you approach, a lamb chop differently than a steak, differently than a chicken breast, each grape variety sort of does better with its own type of preparation. So. Mm-hmm. I mean, clearly you make reds and whites differently. I don't make any orange wine.
Yet. Ever.
Ever. Well, when I started in the industry, everybody was doing overnight skin contact with the whites, and then so the whites extracted all those tannins, and 3 years later in the bottle they turned orange. I mean, it was essentially orange wine before its time. And, they weren't fermented on the skins, but you'd put and nobody was chilling really. And so they'd bring in hot grapes. Nobody was doing night picking. So the grapes would be picked through the day. It'd come in hot, 80 degrees, put them in a tank. You can't chill them down because there's no convection currents, but you'd crush and pump and put them in a tank, extracting all these tannins. And so I published a paper while I was at CME on the effects of skin contact temperature on Chardonnay juice and wine. And that started the movement away from skin contact. And then while I was at Matanzas, I was the very first one to look at whole cluster pressing. We made a plywood hopper on top of the press and dumped the grapes whole cluster into the press without destemming or pumping or crushing. And now that's standard industry practice, but at the time nobody was doing it. So much of my whole career has been involved in moving California away from phenolic white wines so that they're more food friendly at table and they age better in the bottle. And yeah, the idea of making an orange wine just seems like anathema to me. And let me further dump on orange wine. Nobody talks about this. I mean, all the hipsters are in love with orange wine. It obliterates varietal character. You can't ferment white. You can't tell if it's made with Sauvignon Blanc or Chardonnay or Gewürztraminer. You can't tell.
Yep.
Put that in your pipe and smoke it.
So here's another controversial question. Ready? What's your opinion on wine critics and scores?
Well, you can't live with them and you can't live without them.
It's a very fair answer. So getting down to wine as a consumer, now you were saying that you like to start a meal with white wine and then move on to red. Do you have a preference, red, white, or rosé?
Well, if you had to pick only one of those three, it would be red. There's no question about that. I mean, red wine is, real wine in a way. White wine needs to give way to red at some point in the evening.
What about champagne or sparkling wine?
Well, now you're talking. My wife's, she loves champagne and sparkling white as much as I love Brunello. So, and I like sparkling wine. And, I'll give a tip of the hat to Roeder L'Hermitage. I think is one of the best sparkling wines made in the United States. But my friend Claude Thibault makes an outstanding sparkling wine at Thibault Jennison in Virginia. My own taste runs a little toward the fuller, toastier champagnes, Paul Roger, Krug, Bollinger. If they've been barrel fermented in some old oak, that's good. If they went through malolactic, that's good. If they're a little richer and toastier, that's my preference.
Okay. And since you enjoy wine with food, how do you approach pairing wine and food? Do you think there are hard and fast rules to follow? Or do you sort of play loose with that?
Play loose. I think most people realize that we went through a period 10, 15 years ago where that was overemphasized. Too much was made of it. Basically, the right food and wine pairing is the one that you enjoy. If you like Chardonnay with steak, as many people do, that's fine. That's great. I love it. Some Chardonnay styles, a little oakier, a little lower acid, lend themselves more to that than crisper, leaner styles. But, the main thing I would say is what you need to watch out for, where it really does matter, is when you bring sugar and heat into play in the food. Mm-hmm. So particularly as we think of Pacific Rim cuisine, if food's got a little sugar, if it's got some red chili flakes, you want to stay away from oaked whites. You want to stay away from Chardonnay, other than maybe Louis Michel Chablis or something like that. That's where Riesling comes into play, Kerner comes into play. That's the main thing, because chili pepper and sugar, they're not friendly with the classical sort of Burgundian and Bordelais or Rhônish varieties.
What do you think that somebody who's never tasted your wine is missing out on?
Well, the best wine in California. What else?
Of course.
But I think to extrapolate from your question a little bit, Allison, I would say that specifically, one thing is, people who who have a limited range of experience with California Chardonnay and think that they don't like it, that they only like white Burgundy, and that all California Chardonnay is over-oaked and flabby. Tasting our Chardonnay would be an eye-opener for them, because it's not. Mm-hmm. You put our Chardonnay in a lineup of white Burgundies, and it's not obvious that you could pick it out. So our Chardonnays have similar acidities to white Burgundy, and not a lot of oak, 15 to 25% for the most part, new oak, but fully malolactic, made with native yeast, made with native bacteria, unfiltered, so sort of classic old-style wines. So if space aliens were to land on your property, what wine would you want to present them with that represents who you are? Oh, it would be Chardonnay. I mean, we make 7 different Chardonnays, 5 single vineyard, Hyde, Ritchie, Woolsey Road, Rocchioli, and our own estate, Westside Farms. And then we have the 2 Villages. We've got Russian River Valley and Sonoma Coast. So we make about 60% of our production is Chardonnay. And I think that's the most representative of what we do. So going back into winemaking, we know that every vintage tells a story. Do you think that there are more things that repeat themselves from vintage to vintage, or is there more variation? Depends on which continent you're on. Classically, to a large extent, it's true. There are in France, and there are more variations in Bordeaux and in Burgundy between vintage characters. They get hail, they get they just have more variations. California isn't exactly like the old California Wine Advisory Board used to say, in California every year is a vintage year. But in a way, it is. I mean, about one year out of 10, we have an unusual vintage. And the others, yes, there's some variations, but are they significant? Not really, in my opinion. Speaking as a wine consumer, 11 was the last vintage that was really, really different. But 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, there's a run of vintages that, I mean, I'm sorry out there, the only people who are really trying to make differences out of those vintages are writers. They gotta say something. As far as I'm concerned, there are insignificant differences in terms of the wine in the bottle from those vintages. Mm-hmm. Now, 11 was cold and then it rained. This is an interesting year so far. We've had this has been a cold, wet winter and now spring. It is not going to be an early harvest this year. So this year, there's a lot of weather left, a lot of the season left. We just have bud break, really, but bud break is late. Bud break's like 3 weeks later than normal. So this could be an interesting year, depending on what the weather holds. So, yeah, we do have variations, but not as many as in France. And are there any signs that you look for that will determine the outcome of a harvest? I'm not very good that way. No predictors. One of the main things you look for is at veraison, but what you want is at bloom. And then at bloom in particular, bloom and set, you want consistent, nice weather so that you don't have a really spread out bloom. If you have a really spread out bloom of a week or more, then that's when at veraison you could see in individual clusters some greenberries and some blackberries in the same cluster. And while those greenberries will catch up, that they can be a little retarded in their phenolic development. So that's probably the main thing that we look for is a nice bloom and set, and we can check that at a consistent veraison. In all the years you've been producing wine, do you have any traditions that you start at the beginning of harvest? Anything out of superstition or just tradition? I don't, but our vice president of winemaking, Cameron Fry, does. And he always likes to take a bottle from the previous vintage and uncork it and everybody gets a little bit in the glass to toast, and then we pour the rest of the bottle into the very first bin of grapes. So, and typically it's Chardonnay into Chardonnay. So we do that, and that's our blessing of the grapes.
I like that. When you walk through the vineyard and you're looking at the grapes, or when your grapes are in the cellar, do you ever talk to them? And if so, what do you say to them?
Other than swearing, no, I don't sweet talk the grapes. But yeah, one time I almost I cut a little tip of my finger off with the clippers taking samples, and I had a few choice words there. And if you have to sample and fight your way through the bird netting to get to, in a particular vineyard, that's pretty damn unpleasant. But no, otherwise I'm not sweet talking the grapes.
So when you're not working, how do you spend your free time?
Let's see. Carla and I are both big crossword puzzlers, and so I do the New York Times crossword every day, and then we get the Saturday Wall Street Journal so that we get to read Letty Teague's column, and so then we copy that and both do the Saturday Wall Street Journal puzzle. I used to read more. I used to read novels, but lately I just haven't been. I think maybe and Carla and I hike. Yeah, we hike every weekend, and when we go away, our typical would be breakfast, shower, and then we'd go out and hike and then come back for lunch. So, and then, we finally figured out how to stream video. And so there is these days, Netflix and Amazon, the classic BBC, Bosch is a great series, but we're watching Endeavor now, which is and we watched Bodyguard, and so yeah, one of those after dinner is probably how we, so hiking, eating and drinking,
and streaming television shows,
crosswords, and streaming, after dinner.
And when you have a romantic evening, what would I know you were talking earlier that you sometimes drink different wines. If for a romantic evening, is that what you would follow? You'd each pick the wines you like, or is there something else that you would start with and drink throughout the dinner?
Well, classically, if it were really a special, like an anniversary, that might be more of a tendency to open a bottle of bubbly, which these days most often is domestic, we like Rudd Estate a lot, and often end up with a bottle of that. So
tell me, what is the best piece of advice that you ever received?
I wish I had more advice, but of what advice, I take it the other way. I take it to what advice I've learned over my 68 years that I hope I gave to Claire and Alan. And the first one that comes to mind is Shakespeare, is "To thine own self be true." You absolutely have to do that. You can't not do that. Anytime you are not true to yourself, you're going down a wrong path, and bad things will happen. And then otherwise, the golden rule: treat others as you want to be treated. And then I guess what I would add is do what you say you're going to do. Mm-hmm. Always tell the truth and do what you say you're going to do. And an example of that would be a group of us 2 nights ago were at Valette Restaurant in Healdsburg celebrating Lee Martinelli Sr.'s 80th birthday. And there was Clay Mordson, there was Lee's son Lee and George, there was Mike Haney, his son-in-law, James Hall. And we were talking about stuff, and Lee said, we do our business on a handshake, and that's it, that's the best kind of business is doing. You say what you're going to do, and then you do what you say you're going to do.
Yeah, it's about trust.
Yeah, it's about trust.
Yeah. When you look back at your career, not your personal and family life, because obviously that might be the answer, but when you look back at your career, what would you say is your proudest achievement to date?
to date. That leaves out getting our winery construction completed a few years from now, which will be. But it's hard to, at this point, it's been a family business for 23 years. It's hard to separate the personal from the business. But I would say that the fact that Carla and I have grown our business to the point that we are, we're in 50 states, we're in 28 foreign countries, we have 17 employees, including our 2 children, without partners or investors to date. That's what I'm proudest of.
That's an impressive achievement. Congratulations.
Thank you.
So I have a question for you. Answer the sentence. A table without wine is like?
Oh, well, the classic is a day without sunshine. and that's true. It's hard to improve on that. Honestly, as much as I love Mexican food, to me, it's like a absolutely third choice to have a beer with your burrito. I mean, I would have rosé. I would have Chenin Blanc. I would have a lighter style Zinfandel. I would have Pinot Noir. I mean, there isn't a food in the world that I wouldn't preferentially have wine with. And that said, wine is the beverage of moderation. And you have a neo-prohibitionist element now in the EU and in London and, England and France that's trying to tie all alcohol together as a health threat. And this is the very first thing that Vern Singleton taught us at UC Davis, is that wine is the beverage of moderation because it itself is a food. It's fermented grape juice. And if you drink wine with your meal, compared to drinking a cocktail on an empty stomach, you analyze your blood sugar, and because when you eat food, what happens is the sphincter muscle between your stomach and your small intestine closes, and so when you drink the wine with the food, it stays in the stomach and slows so your blood alcohol level rises more slowly. And whereas if you drink a cocktail on an empty stomach, people go out bar hopping, their blood alcohol spikes really quickly. And that's not healthy. Wine is the beverage of moderation because you enjoy it with food, with meals. That was true 40 years ago, 400 years ago, and it's still true today. And some of the health specialists don't know that and don't want to admit it, but I firmly believe it. And, Bob Mondavi, lived to 90, he said he drinks a bottle of wine a day, a half a bottle at lunch and a half a bottle at dinner. And, I think there's something to it.
Absolutely. So on that note, we've been drinking wine for 400 years, 1,000 years longer. Do you think that we will be drinking wine 200 years from now and 2,000 years from now, assuming we're still around?
I do. I'm a big fan of nature. And wine originated probably 6,000, if not 8,000 years ago in Georgia, or actually maybe even China. I mean, there's residue in old pots. But wine is something that Paul Draper used to say that the grape is the only thing in nature that contains everything it needs to make its finished product. And that's really true. And so wine is this natural thing, and I just have faith that nature, that we as human beings, we're animals, we're part of nature, we're natural ourselves, and it's the same thing. I look at with the internet, these days, and everybody's spending their life on their cell phone and their iPhone, and even despite that, I have faith that human beings will continue to exist in nature and maintain a connection to nature and moving forward through the millennia, and that wine is part of that.
Absolutely. So if paparazzi captured a photo of a person sitting at a table, and on that table was a bottle of your wine, who would you want that person to be drinking it?
The first person that comes to mind is Barack Obama.
Okay.
I would be honored.
Well, I hope one day he does taste it if he hasn't already. And one more question for you before we get to our big wine and music question is, if I had to send you off to a deserted island, what are the 3 wines you would take with you?
I'm going to stipulate that I'm with Carla. So the first wine would be a sparkling wine. Okay. The second wine, and this is unusual, this is odd, but a dry Alsatian Gewürztraminer. And the best domestic example, which we get a case of every year, is Navarro Gewürztraminer. And so, because I just think, I just like that. It goes with a broader range of foods than other. I mean, it could go with veal steak, it goes with cheese, it goes with pork chops, it goes with chicken. And then one red. I'm gravitating toward more and more toward a really rich Syrah, like our Rogers Creek Syrah, or a Chave Hermitage, or a Gigal Côte Rôtie, Chateau d'Ampuis, or Côte Brunet Blonde, or of course one of the Lalas. Yeah, I think I can live with that longer than, say, Pinot Noir or Cabernet.
Okay. Well, that's quite a hefty lineup of wines. So now, before we finish, just the little game we play about wine and music, I want you to tell me, with some of the wines we talked about, what music it either makes you think of or you'd want to be listening to while you are drinking that wine. So let's start with your Alsatian-style Gewürztraminer, or the Navarro Gewürz.
That's early Beethoven. That's symphonies 1, 2, and 3. Or some of the, not the later, but or some of the piano concertos, things like that. Could be some later Mozart, could be Schubert.
Okay. What about that bottle of bubbly? Let's go for one of those beautiful, rich champagnes you were talking about.
Sorry to keep you waiting so long. You're going to edit that that long pause out. To me, good champagne or good sparkling wine always has a cerebral quality to it. And I like the sort of classic period of jazz that Miles Davis and John Coltrane, there's a reason that Kind of Blue is the largest selling jazz album in the world. And that would be that. Okay. There you go.
Your Hyde Chardonnay.
Hyde Chardonnay is Mozart. Is Mozart.
And those Brunellos that you're so addicted to.
Now I think we come to folk music. And for another wine, it could be New Orleans Dixieland Jazz. For another wine, it could be Musette from Paris in the 30s. For the Brunello, of course, it has to be the equivalent of Musette. It would be like 30s Italian with accordions. It could be Django Reinhardt, and Stefan Grappelli. But yeah, I mean, the classic Italian music from the 30s. God, that's like, and a nice plate of pasta, and, that'd be great.
Well, on that note, I'm going to let you go find a plate of pasta and a wine. But David, I want to thank you so much for joining us today at Wine Soundtrack. And before we go, if you can just let our listeners know where they can find your wines and can they visit you?
Yes. Thank you very much, Allison. Thanks for indulging me and making this happen. Of course, these days, and your listeners may be who knows where, our website is pretty simple. It's RameyWine.com. So RameyWine.com. That's singular, not plural. RameyWine.com. And we are open by appointment. 10 and 2, 6 days a week, or special times by appointment. We love to, we have a fair number of direct customers, and we did just start a wine club. So, that's growing pretty rapidly. We're late to that game, but it appears that there's a market for that. And I would say, if you do visit our website, we're going on a river cruise of the Rhone Valley the second week of June. I think it's the second or third week of June 2020. So that could be an opportunity to visit some Rhone wineries together and to enjoy the Rogers Creek Syrah on board this great Uniworld ship.
Well, that sounds great. Thanks so much again for joining us today, and have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to a new episode of Wine Soundtrack USA. For details and updates, visit our website, winesoundtrack.com.